what's going on, everybody? Welcome to a Alchemy Horizons Baldur's Gate Draft Archetype Guide. Here with me, Alex, aka Corticals from the Limited Level Ups podcast and YouTube channel. So if you haven't already heard, Baldur's Gate is going to be the main draft format for the next few months on MTG Arena. Streets of New Capenna on its way out, Baldur's Gate on its way in. I've already drafted it quite a bit myself, and I want to share what I've learned about the draft format. So today, we're going to walk through all 10, and maybe even an 11th draft archetype in there. We're going to be talking about some top cards, ways that you can get into the deck, and how to draft the decks when you're actually in them. All right, let's jump into our first archetype here. We've got Blue-White Blink, and the name of the game in Blue-White is using and reusing Enter the Battlefield effects on cards like Priest of Ancient Lore to draw more cards, or Air Cult Elementor to get some tempo. We've got our Signpost Uncommon here, OG, the Exquisite Blade, which is a good thing to blink itself, but of course, with OG here, if you trigger its ability, you can blink your other cards, get a little bit of an engine going. I want to place an emphasis here on Priest of Ancient Lore. This is a card that I'm going to be talking about a lot today because it's going to be great every single white archetype you see. One of the best things you can blink in this deck. If you played Streets of New Capenna, you know Inspiring Overseer, and you know how good Inspiring Overseer was. Priest of Ancient Lore might look like a bit of a downgrade, and it is, but it's still a great card. It's still a fantastic card. We've got big flyers like Juvenile Mist Dragon and Air Cult Elemental. Maybe the name of the game at the time is not drawing a bunch of cards. You've got enough cards in hand, but your opponent's attacking you with a 5/5 or something. Well, you know, blink your Air Cult Elemental, send that back to their hand. And while OG is a great card, it's not the only thing that does do the blinking. So we've got Blur here, a blue common, exile target creature you control, then you return to the battlefield, draw a card. You can either use this to, let's say, blink a Priest of Ancient Lore, or save your creature from a removal spell or a combat that's gone wrong. We've also got Icewind Stalwart, kind of does the same thing, but attached to a creature. All right, our next deck here is Blue-Green Dragons. It would not be a Dungeons and Dragons set without dragons in it. And this set actually has a lot more dragons than there were in Adventure of the Forgotten Realms if you did play that set. We've got a lot of dragons at common, so it is a real draft archetype you can draft in blue-green, and we're gonna get to also in red-blue and in green-red. So it's actually got 3 decks worth of dragons for you to draft. All 3 of these dragon decks have kind of a slightly different bent to them, and blue-green in particular is all about ramping. Early defenses, ramp cards, and casting giant dragons like Sword Coast Serpent or Dread Lindworm, or if you're lucky, an Earthquake Dragon. The Signpost Uncommon here, Corlessa Scale Singer, is a really nice one. Just 2 mana, 1/4. Nice defensive body, staves off the early aggression, and then the mid game can help you draw dragons off the top of your deck. And you know, you might be thinking, well, how many dragons can I fit in my deck? Like I said, there's a lot of dragons that common and uncommon in this set, so it's not wild to think you could have 8-9 dragons in your deck, and Corlessa is going to draw you quite a few over the course of the game. The formula for playing this deck, it's pretty simple. You got stuff like Scaled Nurture, which is a mana ramp creature that's also a dragon and pays you off for casting dragon spells. We've got another really nice few ramp spells here in the 3-drop slot. Underseller Myconid, just one of the top green commons. This thing's really pushed. One of the best mana accelerant creatures I've seen in a long time in Limited. Follow the Tracks is a nice one too. Ramps you early and then gets you a land that can draw you a card later. You're gonna want some early defense creatures like Underdark Basilisk to make sure you don't die early. And then, you know, an assortment of top end creatures here. Owlbear is a really nice one. It's not a dragon, but it's still one of the really nice things to ramp into. One of the better green commons. Then, yeah, your top end is kind of whatever you'd like, right? This is a deck I wouldn't be afraid to play. I don't know, 5, 6, 7 expensive spells, 5, 6 mana spells. If you've got these ramp spells, you can definitely afford them. All right, our next deck here is one of the other dragon decks. We've got Green-Red Dragons. So Green-Red Dragons is a little more stompy. You're still gonna be casting some of these more expensive dragons. We've got, you know, Emerald Dragon and Red Dragon and some nice top end flyers. We've got Thrakkus the Butcher as the Signpost Uncommon here. Really brings the beats. So 5 mana, 3/4 trample. When it attacks, you double the power of each dragon you control. By adding red to the equation, you get the treasure cards too. There's a lot of red treasure cards in the set, like Improvised Weaponry, like Swashbuckler Extraordinaire, help you cast your expensive cards. So yeah, you could build it a little more like the blue-green deck where you're sitting back, you got some cheap Death Touchers to not die early, or you can just, you know, have this nice curve of green and red beatdown creatures and have a little bit of top ending these dragons here. All right, and the last of the dragon pairs here is blue-red dragons. I see this deck kind of as a aggressive slash tempo-y deck. You got some early attackers in your red creatures. You got some blue spells to keep your opponent off balance. I also want to point out Dragon's Fire, which of course I think reads like a really good spell, and it is a really good removal spell. But in these dragons decks, it's obviously better because a lot of the time it's not just going to be 2 mana deal 3, it's going to be 2 mana deal 4, 2 mana deal 6, you know, if you have a Sword Coast Serpent in your hand or on the battlefield. So really premium spell, you know, not doesn't take a genius to figure out that this card is great, but in these decks it's going to be even better. And of course, the last thing I want to talk about here with these Dragons decks is if you really wanted to, and maybe you couldn't decide what flavor of Dragon deck you were drafting, you could put them all together. There's enough fixing in this set, good fixing, 5-color fixing, like that Undercellar Myconid, like the Pilgrim's Eye, Follow the Tracks, Prophetic Prism, that I do think a deck like this is very viable in this format, especially if you open or get past Miram Sentinel Worm. Just such a fantastic payoff for having a bunch of dragons in your deck. I was playing against the one and only Reed Duke today, and Reed had this card in his deck. He absolutely destroyed me with it. And I just played a Miram, and that is very bad for me. This is very bad for me. All right, next archetype we've got is red-white double team. And this is your classic red-white beatdown deck, but with a slight bit of a twist. It uses the mechanic double team, which is a really cool ability on your aggressive creatures in this set. So let's look at Soldier of the Watch. 2 mana, 2/1 double team. And what is double team? Well, when you attack with Soldier of the Watch, you get an additional copy of that card into your hand. You conjure it into your hand. Then both those cards lose double team. You can't keep chaining them, but just a 2 mana, 2/1 that attacks and draws you another 2 mana, 2/1 is really quite good. We got the signpost in common here, Liara, the Flaming Fist. You can give double team to a creature that doesn't already have double team. So imagine giving double team to a giant dragon or something like that, or just whatever your best creature on the battlefield is. So just some cards I want to point out here. Obviously, you know, note the very low curve, but I think a good rule of thumb is anything that says double team on it is just a good card. So we've got something like Giant Fire Beetles, 3 mana, 2/2 menace. When it attacks, you get another one in your hand. Ganassi Rabble Rousers doesn't look all that impressive, but when you got 2 of them out and you're paying 4 mana to, you'll be attacking with 2 3/3s and maybe even threatening to make them 4/4s in the late game, this card is pretty impressive for a 2-drop. Even something that's a little bit expensive like this Ranger Squadron up here, you'd be surprised how impactful this is when it comes down. If your opponent doesn't have a removal spell for it, they're in for a world of hurt because they're getting attacked with a 3-power flyer, and then next turn you're gonna have another one too. All right, next up we've got Red-Black Treasure, and if you drafted Adventures of the Forgotten Realms, you know how powerful Red-Black Treasure can be. Our signpost in common here is Kalain, Reclusive Painter. 2 mana, 1/2. When it enters the battlefield, you make a treasure, and whenever you spend treasure on a creature, that creature gets a +1/+1 counter for each treasure that you spent on it. If you play Constructed, you're probably familiar with a lot of the cards in this deck, actually, even the commons. Stuff like Shambling Ghast and Deadly Dispute. These cards are so powerful that they've made their way into Constructed, into Standard, and further back, even stuff like Historic and Explorer. Of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the Steal and Sacrifice synergy package that exists in this deck, just like it did in Adventures of the Forgotten Realms. So we don't have Price of Loyalty this time around, we have Incessant Provocation, which is a spell that can take your opponent's creature for the turn. But of course, you don't have any plans of giving it back to them. You want to sacrifice it to your Skullport Merchant, or to your Deadly Dispute, or to your Sepulchre Ghoul. There's a lot of sacrifice outlets in this deck, in these colors, that yeah, when you cast this card, when this goes in the stack, you know you're probably not getting your creature back after the turn's done. Oh, also, one thing I do want to shout out about Red-Black also, I've got a deck that I drafted today, is you can splash some really powerful cards in Red-Black, even if they're not your main colors, even if they're green, like this Verdant Rejuvenation here. I had a game today where I just had a bunch of treasures, I cast Verdant Rejuvenation, I had a Baleful Beholder on the battlefield, and boom, a lot of creatures from my deck went on the battlefield. It was a great time, so don't be afraid to splash an off-color bomb if you see one in Red-Black. Next up, we've got kind of an adjacent archetype here, White-Black Sacrifice / Blink. So the name of the game here is having your creatures leave the battlefield in some way, and of course that can be through creature combat, it can be when your opponent kills something, but it can also be from you sacrificing something, or from you blinking something. The start of the show here, and one of the reasons you're gonna get into this deck, is Minthara of the Absolute, the gold signpost in common here. When I first read her, I was like, okay, yeah, I get it. When things die, my things get bigger. Maybe I'll get +1, +2. And then I saw this card in play, and I went, oh my goodness, my creatures are getting +4 so quickly because it triggers on both players' turn. So not only is this trigger off of creatures dying or you blinking something, it even triggers off of treasures getting sacrificed. So very quickly, your stupid little Shambling Ghast is going to be a 4-power creature. Next up, we've got Green-White Lifegain, which honestly is a pretty straightforward archetype. It's got cards that reward you for gaining life and a bunch of cards that gain life. Our signpost in common here is Trelasera Moondancer. It's 2 mana, 2/2. Whenever you gain life, you put a counter on Trelasera and then you scry one. This is kind of a mid-rangey aggressive deck. It can be a little more aggressive if you've got a lot of white cards, or if it leans a little more grindy, mid-rangey if you've got some of these good top-end green cards like Hill Giant, Herd Gorger, or Owl Bear. You know, these are very good cards. Don't feel like you have to end the game right away. But also cards with lifelink, right? Persistent sources of life gain. Also, Prosperous Innkeeper, one of the better cards in this deck. A turn 2 Prosperous Innkeeper just means that every time you play a creature, your Trelastera triggers, your Celestial Unicorn, which is kind of a different version of Trelastera, that'll trigger. Really a key piece of this deck if you can pick it up. All right, next up we've got Green-Black Graveyard. Very classic for Green-Black, kind of playing this grindy mid-range game with big green creatures and good black removal spells. Green-Black's also got this theme of having 4 or more creature cards in your graveyard. So when you have that threshold of 4 or more creature cards, your creatures like Greyslad or your enchantments like Sigil of Merkle will turn on. They'll get bonuses. We've also got the Signpost uncommon here, Kaga Shadow's Archdruid. So nice little creature that when it attacks, you mill 2 cards, fill your graveyard, and then you get a little bit of card advantage too. One thing I would note about Green-Black is, while it does have this graveyard theme, I wouldn't lean too heavily into it. A lot of the best commons and uncommons I've been talking about today have been green and black. They're just good cards, and if you just put cards like, you know, Shambling Gas and Deadly Dispute, Underseller Myconid, Owl Bear, all these big green creatures in your deck, you're gonna have a pretty good deck. So don't lean too heavily into that graveyard theme. You don't want to take too much time taking the turn off and milling yourself for 4 and, you know, milling yourself for 3 with this card, even though it does draw you cards. You know, if you've got the payoffs, you've got a lot of them, sure, you lean into it a little bit more, but like I said, you're gonna have a really good deck just if you get, you know, the good green and black cards in the first place. All right, last archetype here. We've got Blue-Black Combat Trigger. So I left this one for last because I don't think it's that good. So it's kind of built around getting specifically Soul Knife Spy in, making it unblockable different ways, bouncing your opponent's creatures so you can draw cards with it. There's a few other cards in there that really reward you for dealing combat damage to your opponent. But if you've noticed, I haven't mentioned a lot of them today. So, you know, just a little bit of a tip off. I wouldn't lean too hard into this theme. Now, we've got the Signpost uncommon here, Krydal of Baldur's Gate, which is a pretty good card. I do like this card in a vacuum. It's got a good effect on its own. But just like that green-black deck, I wouldn't try too hard to put a bunch of cards in your deck like Thieves' Tools to get in your Soul Knife Spy. Because I think what happens too often is you try really hard, you play your Thieves' Tools, you equip it to your Spy, you get in there, and your opponent just has a removal spell. So the way I would draft this deck instead is kind of like that green-black deck. I would just pick up the good blue cards and the good black cards when you have them. So having a bunch of Krydals is a good reason to be blue-black. I've got Tasha, Unholy Archmage, and John Arenicus here as good blue-black rare reasons to get into this deck. So it's not to say that you shouldn't draft this deck, but I don't think I would worry too much about dealing damage to my opponent to trigger abilities. That's kind of incidental. Just draft it as good blue and black cards. All right, and there you have it. Thank you so much for watching, everybody. This is, like I said, the draft format for the next little while. There's an Arena Open coming up with this as the draft format. There's also a Arena Qualifier weekend that is this Baldur's Gate as the draft format. So it's going to be here for a while. Hope you enjoy and happy drafting.